Hey everyone, SunTide here, and I have finally done it. I've optimized the elemental longswords and figured out which longsword works best against every single monster in the game for each of the 3 different playstyles, and calculated how much extra damage you get from using the optimal elemental longsword. There are a lot of builds here, a lot of things to think about. It took a really long time, but I am finally very satisfied that it's complete. And I wanted to spend today talking about how we actually get to this point and what these builds are. So first off, let's go to that first question. How did we actually create all of this? Well, basically, elemental math is very complicated. I don't think I need to explain this to a lot of you. Basically, unlike just the normal raw calculations where we only need to take into account weapons, armor pieces, and decorations, when we take into account element, there's a whole lot more we need to think about. Not only are there more skills to think about, not only is there an extra stat to think about in the weapons, but we also need to take into account what monster we're fighting and what hit zones they have, because that'll change how much raw and how much elemental damage you will do. We think about what attacks we use, because different attacks have different amounts of raw and elemental damage. We think about what playstyle we use, because if we play a style that has many high element attacks versus a playstyle that has many low elemental attacks, the optimal weapon will change. And finally, we even need to take into account the scrolls, whether we're on the red scroll or the blue scroll, because some certain skills will have different stats, will give you different stats depending on which scroll we're using. So yeah, we need to think about all of these things at the exact same time. And if we do that, that gets very complex. So we need to figure out how to take this big, complicated problem and turn that into something small and dealable. Luckily, we're a decent way through already. So we already figured out how to optimize weapons, armor pieces, and decorations. So I talked about in the last videos how I made a Python code to optimize each weapon for raw damage. So now we need to take that and make it work for raw and element. But to take into account element, we need to take into account all of these things. And we can't really deal with all of them at once. So how do we simplify each of these things into something that can actually be used by a computer for an optimization perspective? Let's talk about attacks and the playstyles first, because I think that's the most interesting. Basically, depending on what attacks you use, you're going to have different amounts of element and raw damage. So for example, Sakura Slash is a very elemental attack. It has really high element and relatively low raw, but not everyone uses Sakura Slash. Most attacks do pretty decent elemental damage, and this includes EI Spirit Slash and Harvest Moon, but again, not everyone uses EI Spirit Slash and Harvest Moon. And Spirit Helmbreaker and especially Sacred Sheath combo do little elemental damage, but very high damage overall. So even if they have low element, we still want to use them a lot in their elemental builds. And it gets really complicated because, for example, you might use Sakura Slash with Sacred Sheath combo. Sakura Slash has very high element and Sacred Sheath combo has a very low element, so how do we take those two together? Basically what I do is I consider a playstyle as a string of normal attacks, some sort of attack that builds up your spirit level, and some sort of finisher that removes your spirit level, and optionally Harvest Moon. Basically, so that means I have split up Longsword into like 3 different playstyles. We have the EI Spirit Slash with the Spirit Helmbreaker, so this is like the classic Longsword from Monster Hunter Rise base game. We have Tempered Spirit Blade and Sacred Sheath, so this is Tempered Spirit Blade to counter a lot, and then use up your spirit with Sacred Sheath, so your Wirebugs are going towards Tempered Spirit Blade. And finally, we put our Wirebugs towards Sakura Slash to increase our spirit, and finish off with Sacred Sheath. Now, depending on how many normal attacks we use between each of these, the amount of element we do will change. Basically what I did is I took all of these, I figured out how many, what normal hits are going to do, to basically the amount of elemental damage that we're going to do in the overall string. Basically this means that if we do, for example, 10 normal hits, followed by an EI Spirit Slash, followed by a Spirit Helmbreaker, we have basically around 3.5 times more elemental damage for our attacks, which is reduced by the monster stats. If you use a Tempered Spirit Blade Sacred Sheath style, the amount decreases to 3.01, and Sakura Slash Sacred Sheath increases it up to 3.95. So we can round that off into like 2 decimal points and get 3.0 for Tempered Spirit Blade, 3.5 for EI Spirit Slash, and 4.0 for Sakura Slash. If you do more normal attacks, the amount of elements you do will increase, and if you do fewer normal attacks, the amount of element you do will decrease in general. If you take into account Harvest Moon doesn't significantly change the playstyle damage ratio, so how much element you do from your playstyle, so that makes it actually much simpler. So basically, from the attacks and playstyles, I can take the attack and playstyle, print them all together, and get one number out of it. 3.5, 3.0, and 4.0, depending on what playstyle you're on. Now, we think about the monsters. Basically, what I did is I looked through every single monster and selected which hit zone we can do the most damage to. Thanks to Robomech for supplying the database for that. So the one that's that we can do most damage to while being most accessible. I assume the monster is enraged when possible. I wasn't quite sure whether to pick the enraged one or enraged one. I just picked the enraged one. But these numbers can be a bit variable, so they're a relatively rough estimate. But this lets us have a monster damage ratio, which is basically how much element versus how much raw a monster will take for that hit zone for every single element. And because we figure out how much element we'll do and how much element the monster will take, we can take those two numbers and put them together to create what we're going to call an effective damage ratio. Basically, we take the monster damage ratio, the playstyle's damage ratio, multiply them together to get this effective damage ratio, which I'm going to abbreviate to EDR. We're going to calculate the EDR for every single monster and every single playstyle. In general, the EDR basically ranges from 0 if a monster is fully immune to an element, to 3 if you have a high element attack playstyle, and the monster is very susceptible to an element while being resistant to raw. And what the EDR basically does is it figures out how much a point of EFE, effective element, is worth compared to a point of effective raw. Basically, if you had an EDR of 2.5, that means that 5 points of element is going to be worth 5 times 2.5 or 12.5 EFR. So if your EDR is above 1, element is more important than raw. If your EDR is below 1, raw is more important than element. But of course, we want to try and get both up at the same time. Keep in mind that this EDR is specific to the playstyle, the element, and the hit zone. So we're going to have a whole bunch of different EDRs for each playstyle and for each element. So we can't deal with literally every single EDR because all the playstyles times all the monsters. It's very complicated. So what I do is I take some approximate EDRs. I take EDRs of 0.5, 1.0, 1.5, 2.0, and 2.5. Then I use my Python algorithm to maximize the damage for each of these EDRs. To maximize damage, including the scrolls, to optimize damage for each of these EDRs. This gives about 20 different optimal builds, split across about 15 different weapons. That's a lot of builds and that's a lot of weapons. But basically, this seems to work decently well. There could be some slight issues. So for example, I might have one build that's optimized for someone having a fire EDR of 1.5, another longsword that's optimized for a fire EDR of 1.0. A monster with a fire EDR of 1.2 might have a third different longsword build, which I didn't take into account. However, that intermediate EDR shouldn't significantly change the overall damage. We might have something that is slightly more optimal for that one specific situation, but A, I think I have enough builds in this already, and B, there's no way to like really definitively prove I have always found the optimal build for every single EDR without taking into account literally every single EDR that exists in the game. Basically, I should get most of them. There might be a secret hidden build, which is doing like 0.1% extra damage to one specific monster. But if so, I don't really care. I'm more interested in the general overall things. But point is, we have about 20 builds and about 15 different weapons. From this, we can take each of those 20 builds and use this against the exact EDR of every single monster's best hit zone. We can then take which of these builds to the maximum amount of damage to that hit zone for that playstyle. I made special builds for monsters that have some weird things, for example, monster exploit and elemental exploit. But basically, this is a compilation of each build that is optimal against the monster for a certain playstyle. For example, if you look over here, we can see Royal Ludroth. On the Royal Ludroth's best hit zone is on the main. If you are using the Sucker Slash playstyle, Volcanic Apocalypse with Elemental Exploit is the most optimally built, which will do 21% more damage than a raw build. If you're using a Spirit Helmbreaker playstyle, Volcanic Apocalypse will still do the most damage, but you want to use a different build. You want to use the more standard build that doesn't use Elemental Exploit, and you'll do 17% more damage than a fully raw build. And if you use the Tempered Spirit Blade playstyle, you'll use the same build, but you'll only do 13% more damage. And I have this for, again, every single monster's best hit zone for every single playstyle. So with that done, let's talk about the actual builds. Basically, I try to optimize each build for specific things here, so I try to make sure each build has Quick Sheath 3, because we're the Longsword and we really like Quick Sheath 3. Unlike some of the other videos, I also try to optimize for Wirebug Whisperer 3, because that is, in general, a relatively important skill here, especially if you're using, for example, Sakura Slash, where you really want to use your Wirebugs on cooldown, basically. Slightly controversially, I optimized for Speed Sharpening 2, not Speed Sharpening 3. Speed Sharpening 3 often did significant impacts on your damage when you're doing element, because a grinder jewel will take the place of an elemental attack jewel. So I took Speed Sharpening 2 as a decent compromise. What's nice is a lot of these weapons have much higher sharpness, so you don't really need to sharpen quite as often, so I thought that was a fair compromise. Of course, many of these builds do get Speed Sharpening 3 anyway, but not all of them. And in general, damage is calculated for the average of the first 50 hits. Again, it doesn't really affect the elemental longswords so much, because most of them have really long sharpness. And partial uptimes are assumed for some skills, like I did for the previous one. So basically here we have the partial uptimes. So we assume Weakness Exploit is working 90% of the time, Chain Crit 100%, Agitator 70%, Massive Amount 50%. We're ignoring performance. We took into account Grinder, but there are no good Grinder builds for Element. And we took Kushal Daora Soul at 95% of the time. These are probably not fully optimal. For example, I probably should have put Chain Crit on the same uptime as Kushal Daora Soul, because they both rely on repetitively hitting the enemy. But these shouldn't significantly change the results so much. And general overall findings, we found out that Element is really strong. Against all but 1 to 3 monsters, an elemental weapon is optimal. So the exceptions are the Crimson Glow Valstrax, because Valstrax is immune to all the elements once it's enrages, so Sunderer is the best against him. And if you're using a Tempered Spirit Blade playstyle, Sunderer is optimal against Astalos and Aurora Somnacanth. If you're using a non-Tempered Spirit Blade playstyle, the element is slightly better. But no significant difference. So yeah, 1 to 3 of these different monsters are most typical to raw. Everyone else uses element on. With regards to Mail of Hellfire, so Mail of Hellfire is one of the skills that give you different stats depending on what scroll you're on. Red scroll is always going to be the best. So red scroll is the one that gives you plus raw. The blue scroll, which gives you plus element, is not going to be worth it, at least at 1 point. So yeah, if you can, try and stay at red scroll, even if you are using Sakura Slash. And general findings, so in general we have around 3 builds, using around 2 different weapons for each element. In general, these builds are a very high element weapon with critical element, a very high element weapon with a raw focus build, and a relatively low elemental weapon with a raw focus build. These raw focus builds are generally going to be the same. So I call this standard build. I've also called it the LABSI build. So LABSI stands for Lunagaran Helm, Archfiend Armor Bowlow, Barrier Fan vs. X, and Sinister Grudge Tacits, along with Increase X and a Quick Sheath 2-2-2-0 charm. So this set is like really good and optimized for raw. It gives you a lot of cool different things. With this, you're going to put in 2 Tenderizer jewels, 3 critical jewels, and 1 Wirebug Whisperer plus a jewel. And once you do that, you'll still have space for 5 1 slots, 2 2 slots, and 1 3 slot. And even before you use those extra slots, you'll have Quick Sheath 3, Weakness Exploit 3, Critical Boost 3, Wirebug Whisperer 3, Critical Eye 6, which can get up to 7 by using 1 slot, Attack Boost 2, which can get up to 4 by using 2 slots, 1 free point of Maximum Mind, Chain Crit, which is very, very good, especially for Element. 1 point gives you a lot of damage. Mail of Hellfire, which also gives a lot of raw. And you also get free Coalescence and Resentment, which I don't use for the calculation, but it's sort of a nice bonus to have. So yeah, with that in mind, let's see an example of that sort of LABSI standard build, which is the raw build. So I posted basically the same thing the other day. This time I just picked the alternatives that let you use Warble Whisperer 3. So again, we have the 5 pieces with LABSI, Lunagaron, Archfiend, Barrier, Sinister, and Ingot. We use the extra slots to put an Expert Jewel to get Crit I7. We use 2 attack jewels to get attack boost 4. We have 1 Mighty Jewel to hit maximum at 2, because why not? We can use that for something else if we want. Wirebug Whisperer 3, and we also have space to have Grinder 3, and we still have 2 free 1 slots. Yeah, so this is an example of the LABSI build. We pick which extra decorations we want depending on the specific weapon. And again, this is optimal against Crimson Glow Valstrax and possibly Astalos and Aurora Somnacanth. However, let's move on to talk about the actual elements. We're going to go one element at a time. So fire. So for fire, the best longsword for high element is going to be the Volcanic Apocalypse. This one is really, really, really good. So it has a whole lot of element and a space to use elemental exploit. So on screen you can see the elemental exploit build. So this is not a LABSI build, this has very different equipment. So Case of Crown, Sinister Grudge Garb, Barreth Van Braces, Archfiend Armor Ura, and Kadachi Greaves. And again, we have elemental exploit. This way we really, really focus in on having really, really high elemental damage. So this build does have speed sharpening 3, which is very, very nice. Fire attack 5, so again, we're really, really focusing on fire attack. And we also have chain crit 2, so we get chain crit from our armor pieces, and when we are really using these element pieces, we really want to use chain crit just for that extra bit of elemental damage. Here is the LABSI standard build. So here we're having crit I7, attack boost 4. We only have speed sharpening 2 because we're using all of our extra slots on getting fire attack up to 5, which is very, very important. But we have C hits at maximum sharpness. And yes, so this is good against a lot of other enemies. So if you look at this table, for example, so Chameleos, for example, is weak to Volcanic Apocalypse. With high element, we can use the elemental exploit ones. With a lower element playstyle, we can use the standard ones. So yeah, you can see on this sheet which enemy is weak to what weapon. Finally, when a monster is only slightly weak to an element, we want to use the Lohenschwert plus. This one uses a standard LABSI build, crit I7. You can see this is going to be useful in, for example, against, who is it useful for? Not very many enemies. So it seems only against Aurora Somnacanth if we're using the higher elemental builds. Yeah, I don't think there's anything else that it's useful for. So this is probably one of the more ignorable longsword builds. We can, in theory, just use Sunderer for those. But if we want to be fully optimal, Lohenschwert is the way to go. With that, we can move on to the water builds. So the high element water longsword is the Abyss Bringer Blade, and like the previous one, like the Volcanic Apocalypse, we're going to have a high elemental build with elemental exploit and a LABSI build. So this also has a really, really, really high element and can use elemental exploit, so it's good against enemies that are very weak to element, especially if you're using the high element playstyles. So it's useful, for example, against Anjanath. Because its element is so high, it's just really, really good on the builds that use Sakura Slash. So you can see that, for example, against Magma, which is weak to both water and thunder, the high raw builds want to use Oppressor's Abyss, the Thunder Longsword, whereas the Sakura Slash wants to use the Abyss Bringer Blade for its higher element. And this one is very, very good against a lot of different monsters and does pretty solid damage. So you can see against Pyre, Ragnar, Kadaki, we get 21% extra damage. So again, we have the LABSI build, and that's basically the only water longsword in the game that's worth using. Someone on YouTube asked for non-Abyss Bringer Blade longswords, so the Valstrax comes in second place, but it's never really optimal, so you can use it if you want, but it's not optimal. For water, you can use Abyss Bringer Blade. Next up is Thunder. So the best high element Thunder weapon is Oppressor's Abyss. Now, Oppressor's Abyss is a bit interesting because unlike the other longswords we talked about that have really high element, This one can't use Elemental Exploit, but it will still use some Chain Crit. So this one isn't quite the same LABSI build. We change the Ingot Greaves for the Kadachi Greaves to give us 1 point of Chain Crit, which is worth it in some cases. And yeah, it does slightly improve your damage in some situations. We also have the standard LABSI build. And for enemies that aren't very weak to Thunder, we can use the Shockstrike. So the Shockstrike is another LABSI build. And yeah, so all of the enemies are really weak to Thunder. A lot of enemies are actually really weak to Thunder. So what I mean by this is, for example, the Hermitor, if I can find it. So sorry, not the Hermitor, the Cyanotor, if I can find it. Should be alphabetical order. Shogun Cyanotor. Oops. Yep. Shogun Cyanotor. Yes, the Elemental build does 30% more damage than the pure raw build. It's very significant. So yeah, Shogun Cyanotor is one of the main reasons you want to build this if you really don't like that monster. For example, if you really hate it after Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate and you need it to get the best longsword. But other than that, in general, a lot of enemies are just slightly weak to Thunder. So actually, I talked about this in a previous video, but on average, these longswords actually do the most damage in the game. More than the raw longsword. On average, this one does about an extra 1 or 2% more damage than the purely raw longsword. So yeah, for general use, you can actually viably use Thunder, especially because the Oppressor's Abyssal looks really cool. The second last element we're going to talk about is Ice. So this one is much more akin to the others, but with a few extra options. So we have a high Elemental Exploit build, as usual. So this one has Elemental Exploit and a point of Chain Crit. We have a LABSI build for enemies that are weak but not quite weak to Ice. But we have 2 ice weapons that are also pretty good depending on the enemy's exact weakness. So we have the Daora's Storm, which has slightly lower element and slightly higher raw, and with even slightly lower element and higher raw, we have the Frostveldt. So yeah, a lot of enemies are going to be weak to some of these. So Flicker Blizzard Slash is going to be the best one, but sometimes, for example, we can use the Frostveldt against the Aspelos, or the Daora's Storm against the Apex Zinogre. But again, this isn't going to be very common. And Frostveldt is going to be useful more on the Tempered Spirit Blade builds, just because that one doesn't use quite as much element. So that one's useful against Zinogre, for example, but you only get like 1% extra damage. Now, last element we're going to go through is Dragon, and this one is very interesting because a lot of people still seem to think that the Abyssal Flicker is very good for element. It's not. Or is it? I'll talk about it more later. But basically, the real best Dragon Longsword is the Red Flash, the Valstrax Longsword. There aren't really any Dragon Longswords that have really high element. Even the Red Flash is relatively slightly raw focused. But yeah, so it's going to be useful in a lot of different situations. So for example, against Malzena, where you get like 20%, 16%, 13% more damage, the Dragon Longsword that has more raw than element is the Screakscythe. So the Screakscythe is the second best Dragon Longsword. And we're going to have we're basically going to have 2 builds. So they're both LABSI builds, but one of them basically uses Attack Boost 4 with higher crit, and the other one uses Attack Boost 7 with lower crit. Of course, we also had to make some slight exceptions in this. So those exceptions are as follows. So basically 3 monsters are immune to Monster Exploit. Pyrarachna Kadaki is one of them. Luckily, it's not an exception because it is so weak to, I believe it's water, that we can just use a standard Elemental Exploit build. We aren't going to use a Monster Exploit skill against it. Yes, so if I try and find where it is, this is very large. Yep, so Pyrarachna Kadaki. That is Spirit Blade with Elemental Exploit. Rachna Kadaki is also immune to things, so if we look for Rachna Kadaki, so Basically, because of this, because it's not weak to a specific element, there is a specific build that uses Daora's Soul. That is slightly more optimal. So you can build this specific Rachna Kadaki build, which I'm going to show on screen now. There are basically going to be 2 of them. Yeah, depending on which playstyle you're using. One higher focused on raw and one higher focused on element. And the last exception is the final boss, which is not weak to monster exploit. There is a Dragon Longsword which can use Daora's Soul, which people think is very good. It's still not. So even Abyssal Flicker is just not good. It's never optimal in the conditions we discuss. Basically, the final boss is more weak to Red Flash if you're, or Screakscythe, depending on what level of element you're using. Even if your ramp-up slot is going to be useless, these 2 weapons are still that much better than Abyssal Flicker. Abyssal Flicker is never going to be optimal. However, other weapons that do have the words Abyss or Flicker are optimal. Yeah, so Abyssal Flicker isn't even the best Abyssal Longsword or Flicker Longsword. Yeah, so I'm gonna stop just hating on Abyssal Flicker, but basically, yeah, if you want to use Abyssal Flicker, use it because you think it's cool, not because you think it's optimal. It's worse for raw, it's worse on average, and it's never the best against a specific monster. Yeah, on average you want to use raw or thunder. Against a specific monster you want to use Red Flash or Screakscythe. And yeah, it possibly has a slight use in high sharpness builds, but oh wait, no, that doesn't make sense because the Red Flash has 140 hits of wide sharpness. It's never going to be. Abyssal Flash is never going to be useful. It's outclassed wholly by the Red Flash, the Screakscythe, the Thunder Longswords, and the Sunderer. So yeah. Anyway, that's basically the end of the video. So here we found the optimal builds to maximize damage against every single monster in the game. This was done by optimizing builds for different effective damage ratios, or EDRs, and directly testing the set on a monster for every single playstyle. And you can see that here. Yeah, all resources should be in the description, but otherwise I would really like to thank you all for watching. Like and subscribe and all those things. Monster Hunter videos will be coming up eventually, but I'm going to be taking a YouTube Monster Hunter. I'm going to be playing Xenoblade, because Xenoblade is coming out and I'm very excited. But yeah, so I'll still be around. Hit me up if you need anything in particular. But otherwise, I will see you all next time.